I am going to start reading the last time I left off. Um, Count Olaf was upset with the kids because he didn't want the sauce or anything that they made. Instead, he wanted more expensive dinner, but he didn't even leave that kind of money. So he's just giving the kids a really hard time, and they still have to feed the party of people that he has. So I'm at page 50. I would like to get through a couple of chapters. Let's see how much I can read to you in 20 minutes. Sonny continued to wail, and Klaus found that his eyes were wet with tears as well. Only Violet didn't cry, but merely trembled with fear and revulsion, a word which means here an unpleasant mixture of horror and disgust. For several moments none of them could speak. "This is a terrible, terrible," Klaus said finally. "Violet, what can we do?" "I don't know," she said. "I'm afraid." "Me too," Klaus said. "Hooks," Sonny said as she stopped crying. "Let's have some dinner," someone shouted from the dining room, and the theater troupe began pounding on the table in strict rhythm, which is an exceedingly rude thing to do. "We'd better serve the puttanesca," Klaus said, "or who knows what Count Olaf will do to us." Violet thought of what the bald man had said about racking her face and nodded. The two of them looked at the pot of bubbling sauce, which had seemed so cozy while they were making it, and now looked like a vat of blood. Then, leaving Sonny behind in the kitchen, they walked into the dining room, Klaus carrying a bowl of the interestingly shaped noodles, and Violet carrying the pot of puttanesca sauce, and a large ladle with which to serve it. The theater troupe was talking and crackling, drinking again and again from their wine cups, and paying no attention to the Baudelaire orphans as they circled the table serving everyone dinner. Violet's right hand ached from holding the heavy ladle. She thought of switching to her left hand, but because she was right-handed, she was afraid she might spill the sauce with her left hand, which could enrage Count Olaf again. She stared miserably at Olaf's plate of food and found herself wishing she had brought poison at the market and put it in the puttanesca sauce. Finally, they were through serving, and Klaus and Violet slipped back into the kitchen. They listened to the wild, rough laughter of the Count Olaf and his theater troupe, and they picked at their own portions of food, too miserable to eat. Before long, Olaf's friends were pounding on the table in strict rhythm again, and the orphans went out to the dining room to clear the table, and then again to serve the chocolate pudding. By now it was obvious that Count Olaf and his associates had drunk a great deal of wine, and they slouched at their table and spoke much less. Finally, they roused themselves and trooped back through the kitchen, scarcely glancing at the children on their way out of the house. Count Olaf looked around the room, which was filled with dirty dishes. "Because you haven't cleaned up yet," he said to the orphans, "I suppose you can be excused from attending tonight's performance. But after cleaning up, you are to go straight to your beds." Klaus had been glaring at the floor, trying to hide how upset he was. But at this, he could not remain silent. "You mean our bed," he shouted. "You have only provided us with one bed." Members of the theater troupe stopped in their tracks at this outburst and glanced from Klaus to Count Olaf to see what would happen next. Count Olaf raised one eyebrow, and his eyes shone bright, but he spoke calmly. "If you would like another bed, tomorrow you may go into town and purchase one." "You know perfectly well we haven't any money." "Of course you do," Count Olaf said. and his voice began to get a little louder. You are the inheritance of an enormous fortune. That money is to be used until Violet is of age. Count Olaf's face grew very red. For a moment he said nothing. Then, in one sudden movement, he reached down and struck Klaus across the face. Klaus fell to the floor, his face inches from the eye tattooed on Olaf's ankle. His glasses leaped from his face and skittered into a corner. His left cheek, where Olaf had struck him, felt as if it were on fire. The theater troupe laughed, and a few of them applauded, as if Count Olaf had done something very brave instead of something very mean. Come on, friends, Count Olaf said to his comrades. We'll be late for our own performance. If I know you, Olaf, said the man with hook hands, you figure out a way to get that Baudelaire money. We'll see, Count Olaf said, but his eyes were shining bright as if he already had an idea. There was another loud boom at the front door shut behind Count Olaf and his terrible friends, and the Baudelaire children were alone in the kitchen. Violet knelt at Klaus's side, giving him a hug to try to make him feel better. Sonny crawled over to his glasses, picked them up, and brought them to him. Klaus began to sob, not so much from the pain, but from the rage at the terrible situation they were in. Violet and Sonny cried with him, and they continued weeping as they washed the dishes, and as they blew out the candles in the dining room, and as they changed out of their clothing and lay down to go to sleep. Klaus in the bed, Violet on the floor, Sonny on the low cushion of the curtains. The moonlight shone through the window, and if anyone had looked into the Baudelaire's orphan's bedroom, they would have seen the three children crying quietly all night long. Chapter 5. Unless you have been very, very lucky, you have undoubtedly experienced events in your life that have made you cry. So unless you have been very, very lucky, you know that a good long session of weeping can often make you feel better, even if your circumstances have not changed one bit. So it was with the Baudelaire orphans. Having cried all night, they rose the next morning feeling as if a weight were off their shoulders. The three children knew, of course, that they were still in a terrible situation, but they thought they might do something to make it better. The morning note from Count Olaf ordered them to chop firewood in the backyard, and as Violet and Klaus swung an axe down over each log to break it into smaller pieces, they discussed possible plans of action, while Sonny chewed a small piece of wood. Clearly, Klaus said, fingering the ugly bruise on his face where Olaf had struck him, we cannot stay here any longer. I would rather take my chances on the streets than live in this terrible place. But who knows what misfortunes would befall us on the streets, Violet pointed out. At least here we have a roof over our heads. I wish our parents' money could be used now, instead of when you come of age, Klaus said. Then we could buy a castle and live in it with armed guards patrolling the outside to keep out Count Olaf and his troop. And I could have a large inventing studio, Violet said wistfully. She swung the axe down and split a log nearly into two, filled with gears and pulleys and wires and an elaborate computer system. And I could have a large library, Klaus said, as comfortable as Justice Stratus's, but more enormous. Gibbo, Sonny shrieked, which appeared to mean, and I could have lots of things to bite. But in the meantime, Violet said, we have to do something about our predicament. Perhaps Justice Stratus could adopt us, Klaus said. She said we were always welcome in her home, but she meant for a visit, or to use her library, Violet pointed out. She didn't mean to live. Perhaps if we explained our situation to her, she would agree to adopt us, Klaus said hopefully. But when Violet looked at him, she saw that he knew it was of no use. Adoption is an enormous decision and not likely to happen impulsively. I'm sure you in your life have occasionally wished to be raised by different people than the ones who are raising you, but you knew in your heart that the chances of this were very slim. I think we should go visit Mr. Poe, Violet said. He told us when he dropped us here that we could contact him at the bank if we had any questions. We don't really have a question, Klaus said. We have a complaint. He was thinking of Mr. Poe walking toward them at Brimley Beach with a terrible message. Even though the fire was, of course, not Mr. Poe's fault, Klaus was reluctant to see Mr. Poe because he was afraid of getting more bad news. I can't think of anyone else to contact, Violet said. Mr. Poe is in charge of our affairs, and I'm sure if he knew how horrid Count Olaf is, he would take us